The most dangerous part isn't the betrayal. The most dangerous part isn't the lies. It isn't the manipulation. It isn't even the heartbreak. People think the worst thing that can happen to an empath is being hurt by someone they loved, but they are wrong. The true horror begins much later. It begins the moment the empath stops speaking, because what most people mistake for weakness was never weakness. What they mistake for forgiveness was never forgiveness. What they mistake for endless patience was actually a silent war happening beneath the surface. A war no one could see. A war the empath fought alone. And one day, without warning, something changes. No screaming, no dramatic goodbye, no emotional explosion, just silence. A silence so deep it feels unnatural. A silence that confuses manipulators, terrifies narcissists, and shocks the very people who thought the empath would stay forever. Because when an empath goes quiet after being hurt, something profound is happening inside them. Something psychological, something ancient, something that most people completely misunderstand. What appears to be withdrawal is often transformation. What appears to be surrender is often awakening. And what appears to be the end may actually be the beginning of the most powerful chapter of their life. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Chase Hughes discovered something fascinating about human behavior. The traits people suppress do not disappear. They wait. They gather strength in the shadows, and eventually they return, stronger, darker, more complete. Hughes understood something terrifying about emotionally sensitive people. The very qualities that make them vulnerable also contain the blueprint for their greatest power. According to Jungian psychology, every human being carries hidden aspects of themselves deep within the unconscious. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it contains the parts of ourselves we have rejected, the emotions we buried, the truths we refused to acknowledge, the boundaries we were afraid to enforce. For many empaths, that shadow contains something unexpected: anger, strength, authority, self-protection, the ability to say no, the ability to walk away, the ability to stop rescuing people who refuse to save themselves. Yet for years, these qualities remain hidden, because empaths are often taught that love means sacrifice, that kindness means tolerance, that understanding means endurance. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin abandoning themselves. This is what Jung referred to as psychological compensation. The psyche seeks balance. When one part of the personality is overdeveloped, another part waits in the darkness, growing stronger, preparing to restore equilibrium. The empath rarely notices this process happening, because they are too busy carrying everyone else's burdens. Too busy fixing, healing, understanding, forgiving, excusing, absorbing. Like a sponge dropped into an ocean of suffering, they soak up the pain of everyone around them. The wounded friend, the emotionally unavailable partner, the narcissist who promises change, the family member who only calls when they need something. The empath absorbs it all, again and again and again, until they no longer remember where other people's pain ends and their own begins. Imagine pouring water into a well with no bottom. Day after day, year after year, giving more, explaining more, loving more, sacrificing more, believing that eventually the well will fill, but it never does. Because some people are not looking for love, they are looking for supply. And empaths often mistake emotional hunger for emotional depth. So they stay, long after the warning signs appear, long after the respect disappears, long after the relationship becomes one-sided. They stay because they remember who the person could be, who they once were, who they promised they would become. And in doing so, they slowly drift away from themselves. Every disappointment becomes another stone carried in silence. Every betrayal becomes another wound hidden beneath a smile. Every broken promise becomes another reason to work harder, love harder, give harder, as though more sacrifice will finally create the connection they desperately seek. But it never comes. Because bridges built by one person eventually collapse under their own weight. And still, the empath keeps building, keeps hoping, keeps believing, keeps waiting. The tragedy is not that they are weak. The tragedy is that they are extraordinarily strong. Strong enough to survive treatment that would have driven others away years earlier. Strong enough to forgive things that should never have required forgiveness. Strong enough to carry emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. But strength without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And that is where the silent suffering begins. Slowly, almost invisibly, a part of the empath starts disappearing. Not all at once, piece by piece. They stop expressing their needs. They stop honoring their instincts. They stop trusting their anger. They stop listening to the quiet voice inside that says, "This is hurting you. This is not love. This is costing you too much." Instead, they silence themselves to keep the peace. And every act of self-silencing becomes another brick in a prison they unknowingly build around their own soul. The irony is devastating. The more they try to preserve the relationship, the more they lose the relationship with themselves. Like a lighthouse forced to shine only inward, they become disconnected from their own guidance, disconnected from their own truth, disconnected from their own identity. And yet beneath all of this, something is changing. Something is watching. Something is waiting. The unconscious mind keeps score. Every ignored boundary, every swallowed truth, every moment of self-abandonment, Nothing is forgotten. Nothing disappears. It accumulates, quietly, patiently, like pressure building beneath the surface of the earth. And one day, the fault line breaks. Not with chaos, not with rage, but with something far more unsettling. Silence. Silence. Not the silence of sadness, not the silence of punishment, not the silence designed to make someone chase them. This silence is different. It arrives with a stillness that feels almost supernatural, because the moment an empath finally reaches their breaking point rarely looks the way people expect. There is no dramatic confrontation, no emotional collapse, no final argument that shakes the walls. In fact, from the outside, almost nothing appears to happen at all. That is what makes it so dangerous. The true breaking point is not explosive. It is quiet, terrifyingly quiet. Imagine listening to a machine that has been running for years. Constant noise, constant movement, constant effort. Then suddenly, it stops. No warning, no gradual slowdown, just silence. The absence of sound becomes more disturbing than the noise ever was. That is exactly what happens inside the empath. For years, their emotional energy has been flowing outward, giving, understanding, forgiving, repairing, explaining, trying, always trying. Then one day, something inside them recognizes a truth it can no longer ignore. Nothing is changing. The sacrifices are not creating love. The understanding is not creating respect. The patience is not creating transformation. The emotional investment is producing no return. And in that instant, a hidden realization emerges from the unconscious. A realization so powerful, it changes everything. The person they have been trying to save does not want to be saved. The person they have been trying to understand has never truly tried to understand them. The person they have been fighting for would never fight the same battle for them. The realization lands with the force of lightning, yet outwardly, it looks like nothing. Because the shift happens internally. A lock turns, a switch flips, a receiver shuts down, the signal disappears. And once that signal disappears, it rarely returns. This is the moment most manipulators never see coming. They become accustomed to emotional access, accustomed to influence, accustomed to having a permanent doorway into the empath's heart. But one day they reach for that doorway and discover it has been sealed. Not slammed, not barricaded, sealed. Like an ancient gate that quietly closed during the night. No announcement, no warning, no negotiation, just closure. The terrifying part is how calm it feels. The empath is not consumed by rage. They are not plotting revenge. They are not rehearsing arguments in their head. In fact, many describe feeling strangely peaceful, as though a battle that lasted years has suddenly ended, as though a radio that blasted static for decades has finally gone silent. This is why the shift confuses people, because most individuals expect emotional injury to create emotional chaos. But after enough pain, a different response emerges. Clarity. Cold. Sharp. Absolute clarity. And clarity is often mistaken for indifference, but they are not the same thing. Indifference says, I do not care. Clarity says, I finally see. The empath finally sees the pattern, the manipulation, the cycles, the promises, the excuses, the emotional traps disguised as connection. The illusion breaks. And once an illusion shatters, it can never be viewed the same way again. Imagine discovering that a beautiful bridge you trusted for years was never connected to the other side. You would not continue walking across it. You would stop, immediately. Not because you became cruel, but because reality finally revealed itself. That is the silent click. The moment reality overrides hope. The moment truth becomes stronger than attachment. The moment self-preservation becomes stronger than self-sacrifice. According to Jungian psychology, this is where a deeper transformation begins. Jung believed that when a person suppresses parts of themselves for too long, the psyche eventually demands balance. The unconscious pushes toward psychic equilibrium, toward wholeness, toward integration, toward truth. And for many empaths, the breaking point is not destruction. It is the beginning of that process. What dies is not love. What dies is self-abandonment. What dies is illusion. What dies is the exhausting belief that endless giving can force someone to value what they have. The empath does not become heartless. The empath becomes honest. And honesty changes everything. Because buried beneath years of people-pleasing lies a forgotten self. A self that never truly disappeared. A self waiting patiently beneath the surface. A self carrying every boundary they ignored, every truth they swallowed, every instinct they silenced, every warning they dismissed. And now that self begins to rise. This is what Hughes understood about human behavior. Suppressed traits never vanish. They accumulate pressure, like water trapped behind a dam, like fire sealed beneath stone, like a rubber band stretched beyond its limit. Eventually the system compensates. Eventually the unconscious fights back. Eventually the forgotten parts demand their return. For years, the empath rejected certain qualities because they feared becoming selfish. They feared becoming cold. They feared becoming harsh. They feared becoming the very people who hurt them. So they pushed those traits away, buried them, locked them in the shadow. But the shadow never stopped existing. It simply waited. And now the waiting is over. Something powerful begins emerging from the darkness. Not cruelty, not bitterness. Power. Authentic power. The power to walk away. The power to disappoint people. The power to stop explaining. The power to stop earning love. the power to exist without permission. This is shadow integration, one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology. People imagine shadow integration means embracing darkness. It does not. It means reclaiming rejected pieces of yourself, the pieces necessary for survival, the pieces necessary for wholeness, the pieces necessary for sovereignty. The empath begins meeting the version of themselves they abandoned years ago, the version that trusted their instincts, the version that honored their limits, the version that understood kindness without self-destruction. At first, this encounter feels unfamiliar, like meeting a stranger in your own reflection. But gradually, something extraordinary happens. The stranger becomes recognizable, the forgotten self comes home, and with every step toward integration, another illusion collapses. The need to rescue everyone collapses. The need to be understood by everyone collapses. The need to carry everyone's emotions collapses. The need to prove their worth collapses. One by one, the chains fall away. Like a leash suddenly severed, like fortress walls finally rising around sacred ground, like a house that spent years unlocked finally securing its doors. Protection no longer feels selfish, it feels necessary. The empath begins understanding a truth that changes their entire reality. Boundaries are not walls built to keep love out. Boundaries are gates that protect what deserves access. And for the first time in their life, they become the gatekeeper. Not fear, not guilt, not obligation, them. The transformation is subtle, but irreversible. Because once an empath discovers their own value, they can never fully return to the person they used to be. The version who accepted crumbs while offering feasts. The version who apologized for existing. The version who confused endurance with love. That person is fading. And in their place, someone new is emerging, someone quieter, someone stronger, someone whole. They did not become cold, they became complete. And completeness is where the real transformation begins. Completeness is where the real transformation begins. Because the moment an empath becomes whole, an unexpected shift occurs in every relationship around them. The people who genuinely loved them feel relief. They witness someone finally standing in their own truth, someone finally honoring their own needs, someone finally stepping out of the role of emotional caretaker and into the role of an equal human being. But manipulators experience something entirely different. Confusion. Deep confusion. Because manipulation depends on predictability. Control requires access, and for years they had access. They knew exactly which buttons to press, exactly which wounds to touch, exactly which fears to activate. Guilt, obligation, hope. Empaths often carried these emotional hooks like invisible threads attached to their nervous system. A single tug could pull them back into conversations they no longer wanted, back into relationships they should have left, back into cycles they promised themselves would never happen again. The manipulator relied on those threads, trusted them, built their entire strategy around them. But now something terrifying has happened. The threads are gone. The hooks no longer connect. The signal no longer reaches its target. Imagine a fisherman casting a line into a lake he has relied upon for years. The same technique, the same bait, the same confidence. Yet every cast returns empty, again and again and again. Nothing bites, nothing responds, nothing moves. That is how manipulation feels when it encounters an empath who has finally awakened. The old tactics stop working. The guilt no longer lands. The accusations lose their weight. The emotional traps become visible. Love bombing becomes transparent. Suddenly the empath sees the performance behind the performance, the hidden motive beneath the words, the agenda concealed behind affection. And once seen, it becomes impossible to unsee. This is why manipulators often become desperate when an empath truly detaches. Not because they suddenly value the empath, but because they can feel control slipping away. The source of emotional supply is disappearing. The audience is leaving the theater. The script is no longer being followed. And without participation, the entire illusion collapses. Many empaths spend years believing they were powerless, years believing they were trapped, years believing they needed permission to leave. But Hughes understood something remarkable about influence. Influence only exists when the other person continues participating. The moment participation ends, the system breaks. The moment emotional investment disappears, control evaporates. Like a shadow vanishing when exposed to direct sunlight. Like fog dissolving beneath morning light. Like a magician whose secrets have been revealed. The power was never where it appeared to be. The power was always hidden inside the empath's willingness to engage. And now that willingness is gone. The manipulator senses it immediately. They may increase their efforts. Suddenly they apologize. Suddenly they remember your value. Suddenly they become attentive. Suddenly they become everything you spent years begging them to become. But something feels different now. The empath sees through it. Not because they became cynical, because they became conscious. The illusion that once felt enchanting now resembles a stage set. Beautiful from a distance, hollow up close. The words sound familiar. The promises sound familiar. The tears sound familiar. The cycle becomes visible in its entirety, and visibility destroys deception. For years, the empath stood inside the maze, trying to find a way out. Now they are above it, looking down, seeing every twist, every turn, every dead end, every trap. Awareness changes everything, because awareness is the birthplace of freedom. And freedom is where psychological immunity begins. This is the stage Jung would have recognized as individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself. Not the self created to please others, not the self created to survive childhood wounds, not the self created to avoid rejection, the authentic self, the integrated self, the sovereign self. Individuation feels strange at first, almost uncomfortable, because many empaths have spent their entire lives defining themselves through usefulness, helping, fixing, saving, understanding, accommodating. Without those roles, a frightening question emerges. Who am I when I stop rescuing everyone? At first, the silence feels unfamiliar, like walking into a house after years of constant noise. No chaos, no emergencies, no emotional fires demanding immediate attention, just stillness. And stillness can feel terrifying when someone has spent their life surviving storms. Yet gradually, that stillness transforms. What once felt empty begins feeling peaceful. What once felt lonely begins feeling spacious. What once felt unfamiliar begins feeling like home. The empath starts noticing something extraordinary. Their nervous system is no longer in survival mode. Their mind becomes clearer. Their emotions become steadier. Their intuition becomes sharper. The constant static that once filled their inner world begins disappearing. Like a radio finally finding the correct frequency. Like muddy water slowly becoming transparent. Like smoke clearing from a battlefield. For the first time in years, they can see. Not through fear, not through attachment, not through desperation, through truth. And truth carries a different energy, a calm energy, a grounded energy, an immovable energy. This is the birth of psychological immunity. Not emotional numbness, not emotional avoidance, immunity. The ability to encounter manipulation without absorbing it. The ability to witness dysfunction without joining it. The ability to hear guilt without accepting responsibility for it. The ability to feel compassion without surrendering boundaries. For years, emotional attacks penetrated deeply because the empath believed every feeling required a response. Now they understand something revolutionary. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every accusation deserves defense. Not every conflict deserves participation. Not every emotional burden belongs to them. This realization creates enormous freedom. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with stones for decades. At some point, you forget the weight is even there. You assume exhaustion is normal. You assume suffering is normal. You assume heaviness is simply part of life. Then one day you set the backpack down. Suddenly your body feels lighter. Suddenly movement becomes effortless. Suddenly the world looks different. The weight was never your identity. It was only something you were carrying. That is exactly what happens psychologically. The empath begins putting down burdens that never belong to them. Other people's expectations, other people's projections, other people's emotional chaos, other people's responsibility. Piece by piece, the load disappears. And as the load disappears, something magnificent emerges. Strength. Not aggressive strength, not dominating strength, quiet strength. The kind of strength that does not need to announce itself. The kind of strength that does not seek approval. The kind of strength that remains calm while others lose control. Like a mountain standing unmoved beneath a storm. Like an ancient fortress untouched by the winds outside its walls. Like armor forged slowly through years of fire. This strength changes everything, because the empath no longer needs to prove their worth. They no longer need to convince others to understand them. They no longer need validation to confirm what they already know. Their value becomes self-evident, internally anchored, externally independent. And perhaps for the first time in their entire life, they experience something many people never reach: inner sovereignty, the sovereignty of self. The realization that their peace is not negotiable. Their boundaries are not requests. Their worth is not up for debate. Their identity is not dependent on anyone else's recognition. They stop seeking permission to exist. And the moment that happens, an entirely new chapter begins. A chapter that many mistake for indifference. But what is actually emerging is something far more profound, something far more powerful, something that very few people ever truly understand. Something that very few people ever truly understand. Because from the outside, it looks like indifference. The empath no longer argues, no longer explains, no longer pleads, no longer fights to be understood, no longer spends sleepless nights crafting the perfect message that might finally make someone see the pain they caused. The effort simply disappears. And for people who benefited from that effort, the change feels shocking, almost unnatural. They remember the version of the empath who always responded, always cared, always tried, always gave one more chance. Now they are faced with someone different, someone quiet, someone calm, someone who seems untouched by the emotional storms that once controlled them. Many mistake this transformation for bitterness, but bitterness is still attachment. Bitterness still seeks engagement. Bitterness still carries emotional investment. What emerges here is something else entirely, something far rarer: transcendence. The empath has finally climbed high enough to see the entire landscape. The patterns, the cycles, the repetitions, the lessons, the illusions. And once seen from that height, many things that once felt enormous begin looking very small. Arguments that once consumed weeks become insignificant. Manipulations that once felt powerful become obvious. People who once seemed impossible to leave lose their psychological grip. Not because they changed, because the empath changed. The cage did not disappear. The empath realized the door had been open all along. This is the final stage many people misunderstand. Because society often glorifies revenge. It celebrates retaliation. It romanticizes proving people wrong. But true psychological evolution moves in the opposite direction. It moves beyond the need to win, beyond the need to punish, beyond the need to be vindicated. The empath reaches a point where they no longer need the other person to admit anything. No confession, no apology, no accountability, no closure. And that freedom is extraordinary, because needing closure from someone who harmed you gives them power they do not deserve. The moment that need dissolves, the final chain breaks. Imagine standing outside a prison you lived in for years. For so long, you believed freedom depended on someone else handing you a key. Then one day you discover the gate was never locked. The prison existed only because you kept waiting for permission to leave. Now you simply walk away. No announcement, no ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just one step, then another, until the prison disappears behind you. That is what true indifference feels like. Not coldness, not cruelty, freedom. The manipulator often cannot comprehend this. They continue searching for the old emotional access, the old reactions, the old openings, but the doors remain closed. Not slammed, not guarded by anger, simply closed. Because access is no longer automatic. The empath has learned something sacred. Their energy is valuable. Their attention is valuable. Their presence is valuable. And not everyone deserves access to those things. This realization changes how they move through the world. They stop explaining their boundaries. They stop defending their decisions. They stop negotiating with people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop shrinking themselves to make others comfortable. They stop translating their truth into forms that are easier for others to accept. Instead, they become rooted, grounded, certain, like a tree that no longer bends toward every passing wind, like a lighthouse that shines regardless of who notices, like a fortress whose gates open only for those who arrive with respect. For years, they searched for safety in other people. Now they discover safety within themselves. For years, they searched for validation in other people. Now they discover validation within themselves. For years, they searched for permission in other people. Now they discover they never needed permission at all. This is what Jung called individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. Not perfect, whole. The integration of strength and compassion, boundaries and empathy, love and self-respect, sensitivity and power. The paradox becomes clear. The qualities the empath feared most were the very qualities needed for liberation. Their anger taught them where boundaries belonged. Their pain taught them where healing was needed. Their disappointment revealed hidden truths. Their silence revealed their power. And their shadow contained the parts of themselves that would ultimately save them. This is why Hughes understood that transformation often looks frightening before it looks beautiful. Because every evolution requires a death. Not physical death, psychological death, the death of illusions, the death of false identities, the death of self-abandonment, the death of old patterns that no longer serve the soul, and every death creates space for rebirth. The empath who goes quiet is not disappearing. They are emerging from years of confusion, emerging from years of emotional exhaustion, emerging from years of carrying burdens that were never theirs, emerging from years of shrinking to fit inside relationships that could never contain who they truly were. The silence is not weakness. The silence is reconstruction. Behind that silence, foundations are being rebuilt. Behind that silence, identity is returning. Behind that silence, sovereignty is awakening. And once sovereignty awakens, very little can threaten it. Because external validation loses its power. Manipulation loses its power. Fear loses its power. Even rejection loses its power. The empath finally understands a truth that changes everything. Their worth was never determined by who stayed. Their worth was never determined by who chose them. Their worth was never determined by who understood them. Their worth existed long before any of those people arrived. And it will continue long after they are gone. That realization creates an almost mystical calm. A calm that cannot be purchased. A calm that cannot be faked. A calm born only through suffering transformed into wisdom. This is the final evolution. Not hatred, not revenge, not emotional numbness. Wisdom. The wisdom to stop chasing. The wisdom to stop proving. The wisdom to stop carrying. The wisdom to stop waiting. And perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to choose themselves. Because in the end, the people who thought they were losing the empath misunderstood what was really happening. The empath was never disappearing. They were returning. Returning to the self they abandoned. Returning to the truth they ignored. Returning to the power they buried. Returning to the soul that waited patiently beneath years of sacrifice. And that is why their silence feels so powerful. Because the silence you hear is not emptiness. It is the sound of illusions collapsing. It is the sound of chains breaking. It is the sound of a wounded identity becoming whole. It is the sound of a soul reclaiming its sovereignty. They are no longer standing at locked doors begging to be loved. They are no longer waiting to be understood. They are no longer waiting to be chosen. They have already chosen themselves. And once that happens, everything changes forever. The silence you hear is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of their freedom. It is the beginning of their wholeness. It is the beginning of their rebirth. Because they were never losing you. They were finding themselves. And the silence you hear now is the sound of a soul becoming whole.